Welcome, distinguished guests, to this crucial session on the road to a People's Loss and Damage Fund. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan left an indelible mark, exposing the shortcomings of foreign aid and the dire consequences of climate-related disasters. Today, we delve into the aftermath, where corruption hinders relief efforts, displacements occur, and communities are left in dire conditions. The rallying cry for a dedicated solution led to the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27. And as we face challenges in operationalizing the LDF at COP28, our focus now is clear. How can we ensure it becomes a beacon of justice, responding effectively to the needs of those in the front lines, empowering communities, and learning from the struggles of those facing climate-induced loss and damage? So without further ado, let's embark on this journey together with our speakers. We now have We now have to open the discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this side event. I'll be giving a brief overview of the loss and damage in Asia Pacific and sharing some impacts on the grassroots communities from Rajasthan in India. Starting with a small background, climate change-induced disasters pose an increasingly serious threat to the Asia-Pacific region, as we all know. And climate disaster-related losses are already enormous in the region and in several other parts of the globe. 2022 alone saw over 140 disasters in Asia-Pacific, leading to 7,500 deaths, affecting 64 million people, and amounting to damages of over $57 billion. Annual losses are estimated to cross $1 trillion or 3% of the regional GDP under a 2-degree warming scenario according to UNSCAP. The most vulnerable subregions and countries with experiences heightened inequality and devastation in the agriculture and energy sectors, compromising food and energy security. There are many countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, etc. in the Asia-Pacific region which are among the most vulnerable. The recent 2022 floods in Pakistan are an evidence of this damage and loss, where it's estimated that the damage was over $30 billion US. India has also seen over $3.5 trillion in losses in over 30 years, according to the University of Delaware. 55 climate vulnerable communities have suffered over $525 billion in damage over 2 decades. Several estimates have put the loss and damage globally over US $400 billion per year, and this is expected to increase rapidly. Based on our experiences of working very closely with the rural communities in India, the nature of impacts on the rural communities is changing. And also, the impacts are very different for different rural communities. More than physical damage, communities face distress due to disruption of services, livelihoods, education, rising debts, and long-term impacts, especially on the low-income groups. There is too little being done and too late. People don't even get 25% of what they have lost. People in the lower income brackets may take decades to overcome the losses. There is no way to measure non-economic losses as yet. The loss of culture, language, heritage, and the complete disruption in case of migration. Disaster relief efforts are also often sporadic and reactive and are not aligned to resilience building. I'd like to share some experiences, very recent experiences from Rajasthan, which is a desert state in India. And this will make it evident that many disasters which are not so spectacular are not even counted many times. Just recently, in June 2023, we all heard that India faced the impacts of cyclone Biparjoy, which originated in the Arabian Sea. These Arabian Sea cyclones are historically very rare because Arabian Sea historically is a cold area and not known for cyclones. But because of climate change, such cyclones are likely to increase in occurrence and intensity, which is a clear indication of the climate crisis. Communities in Rajasthan, which is, as I said, a desert state, are not prepared for such extreme events. Being inland, although the communities did not face the brunt of the impact, but the impacts were still significant. The cyclone caused heavy rains in many areas of the state, leading to flood-like conditions in several regions, with many regions receiving 10 to 13 inches of rainfall in a span of hours. And this is significant for a desert state. Due to changing climate and also as an effect of Biparjoy, Rajasthan saw an unprecedented pre-monsoon rainfall, which was 3 times more than average. In May alone this year, the state received 458% more rainfall than usual. This broke a 105-year-old record. This unusual rainfall pattern caused flooding and damages in several areas, particularly in western desert regions of the state. And these events highlight the growing impact of climate change in the traditionally dry regions like Rajasthan, which are not used to the impacts of cyclones. This was immediately followed by a below normal monsoon season with a rainfall deficit of about 5.6%. Rajasthan, as I said, is known for its arid and semi-arid climate and typically experiences low rainfall. But also the state is heavily dependent on agriculture, which relies on monsoons. These recent variability in rainfall patterns marked by heavy pre-monsoon showers and a deficit during monsoons when the agriculture really needs water has posed a significant challenge for our partner communities. Such unpredictability disrupts farming cycles and traditional farming systems, leading to crop damage, water scarcity, and a threat to farmers' livelihoods and food security due to their lack of coping mechanisms against these new patterns of extreme weather. This deviation from the typical arid climate marked by unexpected heavy rains followed by spells of droughts exemplifies how changing climate patterns can cause significant loss and damage. This harm is twofold: economic, which is apparent as agriculture suffers, but there's also a significant non-economic aspect as the communities are facing stress and upheaval due to their limited abilities to adapt. And the extent of these losses are immense and have yet not been quantified. Sikurdikun, the organization I represent, has been working with these rural communities for over 40 years, and we strongly believe that in the face of adversity, we find not only challenges, but also opportunities to innovate and adapt. We saw this recently because of a long-term strategy to create drought resilience, which also provided relief to farmers in the recent challenging situation. Despite the low monsoon rain, the water conservation structures constructed with the communities in over 200 villages have helped in minimizing the impact of rainfall variability. The heavy pre-monsoon showers recharge the water conservation structures, sustaining the crops despite poor monsoons, while also allowing farmers to take a second crop in the Rabi cycle in these villages, which is not the case for many other villages. Based on our experience of working with the rural communities and the impacts they are facing, we welcome the operationalization of the fund. But there are still several challenges that need to be, questions that need to be decided on. The first is who will pay, as again the fund is only voluntary in nature. Emphasis on insurance might be proven wrong as the frequency and intensity of events rise. Many countries or communities may not be insurable due to the high costs. Who will receive the funds? Whether the poorest countries, all developing countries, SIDS, and how will this be prioritized? What types of damages and losses will be covered? What would be the threshold and to which the countries have been damaged, and how will this be calculated? How will the money be paid out, and whether the most vulnerable communities will have access to the fund directly? Again, based on our experiences of working with the communities and the challenges they are facing, we would like to emphasize several demands. The emphasis should be on deep emission cuts and not the use of funds as a delay tactic. There should be determined replenishment cycle every 5 years with every global stocktake. Money going to the fund should not be the one diverted from adaptation. It should be new and additional. Mechanisms should be developed to assess non-economic losses, especially in the medium term. Minimum percentage allocation for direct access for vulnerable communities should also be defined. World Bank should not profiteer from the fund. Also, the fund should be increased in response to the needs of the developing countries. According to a recent report by Guardian, the currently pledged funds are less than 0.2% of the requirements for developing countries. I'd like to stop here by saying that loss and damage cannot be addressed by the crumbs falling from rich men's tables. We need to do a lot more and very quickly. Thank you.
I thank you, Dr. Bula. I'm from Fiji. Passion of my heart is loss and damage. I have to apologize. I find an extra few minutes to find the room. But brilliant delivery, George. The second speaker for us this morning is Marinelle Ubaldo. I think we all know 10 years ago, something dramatic happened in Philippines, which really take that economy apart. So without further ado, I will ask our second speaker to share her perspective as per the topic given. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and hi everybody. I'm Marina Albaldo. I'm a climate justice activist from the Philippines. I am currently, though, based in the U.S., doing my master's in environmental management, focusing on environmental economics and policy. But I came from a very remote community in the Pacific, right in front of the Pacific in Eastern Samar, called Matarino. So, before we begin, please close your eyes. Can you close your eyes for me? Great, okay. Imagine you're a child and you're living in a coastal fishing community. Every day you have fresh food. You run around your community with the knowledge that you have an unpolluted air. You go to the beach, you play the white sand, get corals, and then swim in the sea. And then you go back to your family, happy eating fresh food, fish and vegetable, and open your eyes. That's my childhood. As a child, I ran freely in beautiful white sand beaches, swam in the ocean whenever I pleased, and collected seashells as if tomorrow didn't matter. This was the beautiful life I knew, until Super Typhoon Haiyan altered the course of my reality. So Haiyan was the strongest typhoon ever recorded. Struck the Philippines in 2013, claiming thousands of lives, including those of my family and friends. This storm shattered the illusion of invincibility that coastal communities like mine had held for so long. It took me 3 years to get back to the ocean again. The same ocean that was once our childhood friend now a source of fear and trauma. Yet, out of this tragedy, we have become so resilient. So, a resilient spirit emerged, and that experience motivated me to take action, to channel grief into advocacy. I became a part of local grassroots organizations submitting it's not actually a lot all grassroots organization, but a lot of organization of farmers, fishermen, youth, community members came together to submit a landmark petition to the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines. This petition called for an investigation into 47 large corporations, or they're called carbon majors, for their contributions to human rights violations linked to climate impact. And after 7 years of relentless battles, the Commission found these companies liable for their role in driving climate change. Our case, the world's first ever climate justice petition, stands as a beacon of hope and basis for future actions. This victory taught me that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, change is possible. This experience led to the realization that community engagement is vital in addressing climate change impacts. So in 2016, I co-founded a Youth Leaders Environmental Action Federation, a youth-led organization in the Philippines. We provide mentorship and training to empower youth organizations in the communities and schools, and we lobbied for change, successfully submitting a petition to the city of Tacloban to ban single-use plastics. The global campaign with Amnesty International's Right for Rights program sought decent relocation for survivors of Super Typhoon Haiyan. It garnered almost 600,000 signatures around the world, showcasing the power of collective action and amplifying the voices of those affected. These successes underscore the importance of collective effort in the fight against climate change. And as of the moment, I'm co-leading a campaign called Make Rich Polluters Pay, along with 3 other activists from around the world. As of 3 days ago, we have 500,642 signatures. This petition is a part of a global movement demanding justice, because we all know that climate change knows no borders, and its impacts are felt most acutely by those who have contributed the least. So in my relentless pursuit of climate justice, I dream of a world where we all share our natural resources equitably, where wealthy nations support the development of those still struggling, and where the biggest polluters are held accountable and responsible for the destruction they've caused. I envision a world where young people have a voice and a seat at the table, where our opinions matter, and where tokenism is nothing but a distant memory. You and I and everyone here have the power to make a difference. In the news, we can hear these phrases repeatedly. We must leave no one behind. There is no time for incremental change. We must act urgently and with transformational intent. We must transition from mere talk to concrete action. The primary missing element in solving our greatest issue is political will. And climate change is hurting people on our planet in ways we can't ignore. It's hitting the most vulnerable the hardest, and those who have contributed the least are suffering the most. The biggest polluters are the ones making obscene profits, but they must be held accountable. They've pumped out emission at an astonishing rate while misleading us and influencing politicians to keep us addicted to oil and gas. And countries like ours, the Philippines, which emit just a fraction of the global carbon, are shouldering the weight of this crisis. We all know, and I have said it all over again, that climate change needs collective action. Our shared natural resources must be equitably distributed, and the wealthiest nation must support those struggling to cope up with the consequences of climate change. So it's time to hold the biggest polluters accountable for the destruction they've caused. And join us, and please visit our site, Make Rich Polluters Pay, and sign our petition. because we have to dismantle the economy rigged to benefit the privileged few while the majority pays the price. It starts by making biggest polluters pay for the mess they've made. And we all know that the loss and damage has been operationalized on the very first day of COP28. But we have also seen that countries like Japan, US, their pledges are like a slap in the face. While I celebrate the operationalization of loss and damage, but the pledges we have now are not enough. There is a report that has just been released by Oxfam, and it says that loss and damage needs at least 3 trillion per year to be fully operationalized, and we know that we're not there yet. So thank you so much for being here today. I am a 26-year-old woman, Asian woman with dreams, and the shadow of climate justice looms over my future. But I fight for a legacy of a healthy planet for my children, a world where they can dream without fear. And I dream of the day I can look them in the eye and say, I fought for your future. So now it's your turn to make this world a better place. So thank you so much for being here and making your mark. Together, collectively, as a movement, we will create a future for our children to see. Join our global campaign, sign our petition, and together, let's make rich polluters pay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marinelle, for those touching and the past few moments for us in the Pacific. We close our eyes to pray. But I think for all of us here, silence is power when we actually try to sink it all in, because that's where the human character of long sufferings and the drive to continue, come what may for the future, to realize your passion. I think that is very, very clear from the second presentation. I thank you so much. The third one is Joy, Ms. Joy Rees. Let me say a few words on Joy. Our next speaker will be discussing the critical role of loss and damage finance for frontline communities, like what we have heard from the Philippines in Typhoon Haiyan survivors, for rebuilding and recovering their lives and livelihood. Joy is a climate justice lawyer from the Philippines. She is the technical advisor of the Climate Policy Center in the Manila Observatory and a staff lawyer at the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center, or what we call as Friends of the Earth in Philippines. Without spending more time, Madam, I invite you to the floor.
Hi, okay. First of all, my apologies for the state of my voice. Yesterday's Global Day of Action was very good. It was nice to see everyone in solidarity with one another. I guess I'll just start by saying that when we talk about loss and damage, that's something that's very, very personal to all of us, right? Like, we can all think about a disaster that has happened in our lives that have taken perhaps the lives of friends and families that we care about. We can resonate here with Marinelle because these are things that we have experienced perhaps individually as persons or of our friends. And so I do think that this is such an important discussion to be had today on climate justice and on what's been happening in the 10 years since. So I think it was very important to have Marinelle talk to you first about Typhoon Haiyan, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to historicize kind of the last 10 years since Typhoon Yolanda hit the Philippines. We know that the stories of climate justice is a story of burdens and benefits. Who gets the burdens, who gets the benefits, and how do we reallocate those benefits so that those who are burdened will have more of those benefits and who will have lives with dignity. We also know that the Philippines is one of the countries that contribute to least to greenhouse gas emissions, but is one of the most impacted by the climate crisis. The German Watch released the 2000 to 2019 report that says the Philippines is number 4 at-risk country because of the climate crisis. And that is the context within which we're having this conversation. So in 2013, as Marinel said, Typhoon Yolanda, international name Typhoon Haiyan, ravaged the central part of the Philippines, leading to the death of more than 6,000 people, and those are confirmed deaths. We still don't know the numbers of those who are missing. We have had difficulty finding data on those whose lives have been displaced, etc. So these are just the official numbers that we have. More than 1 million people have been displaced, 600,000 homes have been ravaged, and these are just those that we can count. We can't even talk about livelihood issues, about issues on agriculture, about issues on food and water security. But in 2013, after that, people like Marinel and many others who are brave and came together in 2015 to file a petition in the Commission of Human Rights in the Philippines. It's a national human rights institution. And basically, like what she said, they questioned the roles of 47 carbon majors and their accountability in the climate crisis. And after many, many, many years, it took 7 years, in May of 2022, the Commission on Human Rights officially released the National Inquiry on Climate Change, which said, among other things, that climate justice is a human rights issue and that carbon majors can be held accountable for their human rights violations. They used as well the UN principles, guiding principles on business and human rights to strengthen this national inquiry. They also said that carbon majors knew of the climate crisis for many, many decades. And so they told financial institutions to stop incentivizing and financing these institutions. So that was a major win. However, we have to understand that the CHR is not a court, and therefore it does not set a legally binding decision. However, what it does do is it sets precedent so that people everywhere, all over the world, can use the decision or the national inquiry to further file legislation or litigation rather to demand climate accountability. This brings us to, in July 22 as well, the UNGA talked about the right of everyone to a healthful environment, and those were definite wins last year. Just this year in 2023, the organization that I'm part of, Friends of the Earth Philippines, as well as Greenpeace Philippines, came together building off of that decision by the Commission on Human Rights to draft a bill that is now known as the Klima Bill. And I'm just gonna spoil myself a little bit. Just a few days ago, this bill was officially filed in the Philippine House of Representatives. So essentially what we did with the bill was we wanted to see how we can be able to legislate loss in funding using carbon majors as the people who will be penalized for the bill, right? So the bill is officially known as an act to institute policies and systems to address climate change, establishing the necessary institutional mechanisms for the protection of most vulnerable communities from loss and damage in the country, providing for corporate and state accountabilities and reparations for violation thereof, and other purposes. So in the main, number one, it created an accountability mechanism for corporations for violations of human rights principles, as well as violating requirements on due diligence and disclosure. Number two, it penalizes corporations for greenwashing, climate denialism, emitting greenhouse gases above a certain threshold, as well as filing SLAPP cases or strategic lawsuits against public participation. The third one is it creates a climate change survivors board and fund where the penalties accrued from these violations can be accessed by communities who are affected by climate disasters. A few weeks ago, Mr. Ian Fry, who is Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, on his visit to the Philippines, said that the bill should be passed into law. And just a few days ago, as I said earlier, or more specifically on the 20th of November, members of the Philippine House of Representatives filed it in the House, making this potentially the first global accountability bill to be filed in the world. This is House Bill 9609. And while we think that the long The journey will still be very, very long. We are very happy that this is now in government, and this is just proof that we are not just survivors of the climate crisis. We are not just victims of the climate crisis. We are at the front lines of pushing for climate justice. And so if passed, the bill will provide the framework for limiting fossil fuel expansion and aligning businesses with the Paris Agreement. And personally, I think that the bill is perfect, a perfect show of loss and damage, climate justice, the allocations of burdens as well as benefits and human rights, as well as funding in one policy instrument. And this is proof, I guess, 10 years from Typhoon Haiyan, that the Filipinos no longer have to rely on the resilience of their spirit, because now there is a policy document that we can refer to if it is passed into law. I guess towards the end of my discussion, I'll just mention very briefly that currently the pledges, while we laud the approval of the blueprint for loss and damage operationalization of the fund, we are currently inching towards 1 billion USD for pledges. The truth is, however, 1 billion USD is paltry, is measly compared to the fact that one Category 5 typhoon is around the same amount. Typhoon Haiyan, whether you look at different sources, was at least 2 billion USD in damages. And so 1 billion USD the current pledges amounting to just 1 billion USD is no longer enough. It has not been enough 10 years ago. It has not been enough 20 years ago. It will definitely not be enough this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. A lot to say there. In Fiji, vividly remember the 16th of February, 2016, Winston, Category 6, the first in the Southern Hemisphere, made landfall. Totally havoc, took the whole economy back 25 years, and we are still struggling. So I fully align myself with what we have heard, and I'm so thankful that you articulate that well in terms of the pledges. We don't want to talk politics at this session, but the issue remains that this is our survival for our people. There's absolutely nothing less than creating a good framework for the loss and damage, which I am personally involved in our negotiation from the Pacific. The next presenter, I think she's online. Bridget, I hope you are online. Bridget Angel?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Give me 30 seconds for a brief introduction. Bridget is a policy officer for climate justice and human rights at Action Solidaire Tas de Monde, a Luxembourg-based development NGO. She also coordinates and supports the member municipalities of Climate Alliance, Luxembourg, with regards to globalization and climate justice issues. Without taking further ado, Bridget, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all. Thank you for a possibility to speak. We have just heard from other speakers that of this day, 10 years later, some survivors of Typhoon Haiyan remain in temporary shelters with limited access to food and clean water. 10 years, we have continued our lives as usual. Loss and damage needs to be taken seriously as the third pillar of climate action. Having a dedicated funding mechanism within the UNFCCC to promote people's rapid and long-lasting recovery from climate-related loss and damage focuses clearly on the fact that climate finance is not aid or charity, but the money owed to the global south by developed countries. Already on the occasion of COP27, ASTM called on the Luxembourgish government to make a pledge according to its fair share for the new Loss and Damage Fund, and not just to come up with a symbolic sum. And here we are again, demanding the same thing A new report by Oxfam illustrates very impressively that the share of polluting the atmosphere is the basis for the ongoing unjust negotiations. It would take around 1,500 years for someone from the bottom 99% of the population to produce as much carbon as the richest billionaires of the world in 1 year. Here we are at the heart of climate justice, compensating for the atmosphere as a natural commons that has not been used equitably for all. After the agreement at COP27 to establish the Loss and Damage Fund, questions came up on the arrangement for its operationalization, how to ensure that the fund effectively responds to the needs of peoples on the front lines, how to empower them to build long-term resilience and delivers justice. The examples from Luxembourg and the EU I want to focus on today are just two among all the countries of the global north that are not fulfilling what frontliners of climate change asked them to do. Through the national contributions to the international climate finance correspond to Luxembourg's responsibility in the international climate finance architecture of the UN. Does Luxembourg and does the EU take their real responsibility? At the opening of the 77th UN General Assembly in New York, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on all development economies to tax the windfall profits of fossil fuel companies. Those funds should be redirected in two ways: to countries suffering loss and damage caused by the climate crisis, and to people struggling with rising food and energy prices. There is no more time to lose with diplomacy-oriented negotiations at the United Nations. Who is serious about climate change and who is not? Guterres made it clear that there's no longer time to leave international climate policy to the member states alone. The adaptation finance of the Green Climate Fund is one of the most important resources for the most vulnerable communities. Given the drastic under-resourcing of adaptation, the Green Climate Fund has the critical mandate to provide a balance of funds between adaptation and mitigation, and to ring-fence more than half of its adaptation funding for small island development states, least development countries and African states. However, considering that the pledge made by the economically strong countries back in Copenhagen in 2009 was to reach the $100 billion target as early as 2020, the current global payment status is nothing less than an indictment of poverty. As in 2020, the participating countries only pledged $83 billion. This is exactly why COP28 must agree on a needs-based, new collective quantified goal on climate finance by integrating loss and damage, instead of leaving this as a question of mere solidarity. The EU is still in denial of this. This is not acceptable. According to the Overseas Development Institute's working paper, A Fair Share of Climate Finance, Luxembourg paid its fair share based on each country's historical responsibility for cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, gross-national income and population size. But what does it mean? Does this also mean that the government is taking the climate policy responsibility for economic activities of all companies based in Luxembourg? Does it mean that Luxembourg is using the legislative, economic and financial opportunities available to it to make national and global climate-friendly decisions? Are the decisions on social and environmental justice really based on the needs of the people concerned? Does Luxembourg and the EU pay their fair share for loss and damage? The sobering answer is no. The reasons are obvious. Just to name one of the reasons: unambitious international targets and negotiations excluding key interlocutors. Although Luxembourg has contributed its fair share to the negotiated $100 billion target, this target is neither socially fair nor climate friendly, as it includes only a fraction of the necessary funds, just like the Loss and Damage Fund. Moreover, it has not been set in consultation with the affected countries of the Global South. The parties involved are aware of this. In addition to climate financing for mitigation and adaptation projects, And in addition to development cooperation, adequate funds must be made available for loss and damage fund. Luxembourg should lobby international for adequate funding of the loss and damage mechanism in accordance with the polluter pays principle and assume its own responsibility in an exemplary manner, financially and fairly, and not only with the 10 billion euros that have been announced. Same refers to the European Union as self-declared leader of climate ambition. We also call upon the governments to advocate for international debt relief for vulnerable states in the context of loss and damage. Since a climate shock can trigger debt crisis almost automatically and overnight, debt relief is an appropriate instrument. A debt relief initiative for highly indebted island states could, in the event of a natural disaster, and only then, transform existing debt, that means debt already budgeted for in public budgets, into an instrument of emergency and reconstruction aid. And as with all financial reporting, transparency should also be key. But what is now the real fair share in climate politics? First of all, inclusiveness is key. The success of COP28 will be determined by how inclusive the parties are. The outcome will not be determined by political feasibility, but by the perspective and the willingness to change for the better by including the most vulnerable people and states. No, we are not all in this together. We didn't all contribute equally to the climate crisis. We haven't all benefited equally from burning fossil fuels, and we are not all suffering the impacts of drought, extreme heat, floods, melting glaciers, and sea level rise in the same way. Climate preparations are about making the polluters pay for the loss and damage they've caused and continue to cause as a matter of justice and economic necessity. The new study, Time to Pay the Piper, offers hope. For the first time, researchers have quantified the economic burden caused by individual companies that have made and continue to make fortunes from heating the planet with fossil fuels. Corporations such as BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Total Energies, Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company, and Chevron are among the top 21 polluters, responsible for US $5.4 trillion in droughts, wildfires, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and other climate disasters by 2050. So these numbers bring us much closer to a realistic estimate of fair climate finance. These numbers give a glimpse of the sums that should be added to what the rich countries owe the global south. Right now, we face the situations that even if all countries were to meet their fair share of climate finance, $100 billion a year remains a fraction of what is needed to support developing countries to achieve their climate goal as stated in the Paris Agreement, not to talk even about loss and damage. Needs amount to an estimated $4 trillion by 2030 to keep to a 1.5 trajectory. And in order to put an end to the continuation of colonial practices in climate financing, the distribution of these funds according to the watering can principle must finally stop. The people living on the front line of climate change in countries of the global south are the ones who have to formulate the financial needs in terms of the damage caused, not those who can afford COP tickets. However, financial compensation is and remains only part of the task. Global justice primarily requires equal access to resources for all and the limitation of one's own ecological footprint to a value that does not impair other people in their way of life and thus also sustainably preserves the basis of life. These demands go out to all governments of the global north. It is absolutely crucial for the global stocktake and the mitigation work program to align seamlessly and that key elements are included in final decisions. This includes also loss and damage, addressing the energy package and executing a rapid and comprehensive phasing out of all fossil fuels to substantially reduce emissions by 2030. That's why we urge the European Union to remain united, leveraging its position to build bridges with the most climate vulnerable countries and not bargaining to bridge the shortfall of finance. The establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, coupled with initial pledges exceeding $700 million, of this including $300 to $400 million from the EU collectively, represents already a positive step. But contributions from developed countries remain in general quite modest, drawing largely from existing climate finance and development budgets, which should be serving for mitigation, adaptation, and human development. Pressure in this context needs to be sustained, particularly on the European Union and its member states, to significantly enhance their contributions and provide new and especially additional pledges in line with historical responsibility for loss and damage to ensure that the financial backing for the fund can make a dent in needs. Many of these pledges and financial commitments made in the first week we've seen here in Dubai were neither new nor additional, potentially redirecting funds from climate finance elsewhere. There is very little reassurance regarding the core annual climate finance obligation of 100 billion US dollars, and little to no reassurance has been offered to scale up adaptation finance to balance mitigation and adaptation finance. Like for loss and damage, the EU and other development countries need to step up here. I want to close here and again addressing the governments of the global north to really recognize loss and damage as a third pillar of international climate financing, because there's no way out if you really are serious about your responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I would now have to, I didn't hear a lot of, thank you so much. I would have to ask for your forbearance if you could wait until the completion of our last speaker, Bridget, to take a few questions from the floor. Is it okay with you? Bridget?
Absolutely, yes. I confirm.
Thank you, ma'am. Our last speaker of the session, we have heard quite a lot from the ladies. On the first day of this COP28, I think no one missed the landmark decision. At the opening of the COP28, there was much celebration around the adoption of the parties, of the operationalization of the Lost and Damaged Fund. For us in the Pacific, that is a long haul. However, civil society raised critical issues on the Loss and Damage Fund and how it will be frameworked and formed, and its implications on the principles of equity, fair shares, historical obligations, and common but differentiated responsibilities. And our next speaker will hopefully touch on this. Ivan Erile is the Climate Justice Program Manager of IBON International, a service institution working with movements and organizations in the Global South. Without further ado, I ask Ivan, you have the floor.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to be non-technical and very brief with our discussion today, because sometimes some of the things that we discuss as policymakers sound very technical and really hard to grasp for frontline communities that are actually dealing with the realities of climate change. I'm actually also going to be covering a topic on the updates regarding the negotiations on the Loss and Damage Fund, how everything panned out prior to COP28, COP28, prior to the COP decision of adopting the draft text of the technical committee of the Loss and Damage Fund. Unfortunately, our speaker, previous speaker, Titi Acosa, isn't available today. She had to go back home. She had an emergency, so I'll try to give justice to her topic as much as possible, although I haven't really closely followed the technical committee negotiations of the Loss and Damage Fund. All right, so let me begin by looking back at what we as civil society's climate justice movement actually won at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So I know some of you here are actually in Egypt when that landmark decision of the COP27 of coming up with a loss and damage fund. Basically, the decision of COP27 was to come up with a new funding arrangements for assisting developing countries in responding to loss and damage, including with a focus on addressing loss and damage. It was also a decision to come up with a fund for responding to loss and damage, whose mandate includes a focus on addressing loss and damage. And then finally, there was a decision to come up with a transitional committee, which is to make recommendations now for the operationalization of the funding arrangements and the fund. So there were a lot of debates between developed and developing countries about the term responding and addressing, but I'm not gonna go into that. Essentially, what the decision, although it was a win, no, it was definitely a win for civil society, for us in the climate justice movement. It does not explicitly provides all the aspects that developing countries ask for in relation to the loss and damage fund. For one, it does not specify where the fund is going to be located. Is it going to be under the convention, under the COP, or is it going to be under the Paris Agreement? So there were a lot of debates under there. There were a lot of vagueness whether the loss and damage fund is actually going to be under the COP or the CMA. It also recalls the convention, the decision, but it doesn't note if the fund is subject to convention principles, particularly the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. So these gaps, these vagueness are going to be the basis for the many disagreements, the many tensions that are going to happen during the Transitional Committee meetings, leading to the adoption of the draft text of COP28. So the Transitional Committee, it was established, as I've said, to make recommendations for the operationalization of the funding arrangements of the fund. This Transitional Committee would consider the institutional arrangements, the structure of governance in terms of reference of the fund. I'm not going to go over the details, or rather the results of each Transitional Committee meetings. Essentially, they had 5 meetings throughout the entire year. But these were the recommendations of the 5th Transitional Committee meeting that happened in November in Abu Dhabi. So what did the TC5 recommendations included? It said that there's going to be a new dedicated independent secretariat hosted by the World Bank, subject to conditions. It also said that it is entrusted with the operation, the Loss and Damage Fund is entrusted with the operation of the financial mechanism of the convention that also serves the Paris Agreement. It is accountable to and function under the guidance of the Paris Agreement and the convention. It also said that developed countries are invited. So the keyword there is that developed countries are being invited, encouraged to contribute to the fund, and that there's going to be a board of the fund, and it will have the legal personality and the capacity to discharge its roles and functions. So again, there were a lot of compromises, negotiations between developed and developing countries when arriving with this decision. Essentially, there were disagreements on 3 fronts on who should receive the fund. So for developed countries, they wanted to limit the scope of the fund. For the European Union, they suggested that the fund should only serve least developed countries, small island developing states, and other vulnerable countries based on a specific criteria. So if that agenda of developed countries actually pushed through, countries like the Philippines, Pakistan, Indonesia, these countries that are, of course, experiencing loss and damage wouldn't be able to have access to the loss and damage fund by that definition. So, of course, developing countries were very much opposed to that restriction. They wanted to make sure all developing countries vulnerable to climate change, vulnerable to loss and damage, would be eligible and should have access. So what did the TC5 text contain? Unfortunately, it does not specify which countries will be eligible, but the fund board would develop a resource allocation system based on the available evidence and with a minimum percentage allocated to LDCs and SIDS. And there was another second front of debate between the developed and developing countries is on the matter of who would be contributing to the fund. So basically, the United States and the European Union, they stress that there is a need to share burden with emerging economies like China and Gulf states. And they also wanted to open up the fund to contributions from the private sector and multilateral development banks. So this is the so-called mosaic of funding sources that we've been hearing at COP27. But for developing countries, they wanted to keep the focus on grant-based finance from developed countries and call for a language reflecting the principles and provisions of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. But so what did the TC5 actually deliver? It does not oblige, so like I've previously said, it does not oblige developed countries to pay into the fund, but urges them to continue to provide support. And it also encourages other countries to do the same on a voluntary basis. Thirdly, and it was the most controversial, is the question on where the fund should be allocated. So as I previously mentioned, the TC5 recommendation was that it establishes the World Bank as an interim host for 4 years and included conditions such as allowing communities to access small grants and access to countries that are not World Bank members. So those are the conditions for the World Bank to actually hosting the Loss and Damage Fund. If it fails to meet those conditions, then the LDF board is going to come up with other solutions for a standalone hosting of the Loss and Damage Fund. But then concerns still remain that the World Bank will end up being the fund's permanent host. So as you've probably heard, many civil society organizations in this space are actually really calling, because it's already the reality that it's going to be the World Bank that's going to host the Loss and Damage Fund. So many civil society organizations are demanding that it does not become a permanent solution. That the hosting of the Loss and Damage Fund by the World Bank is just going to have to be a temporary setting. Because in previous cases, like for instance, the Global Environmental Fund that was established some years ago, and it's being hosted by the World Bank, the setup was supposed to be just a temporary solution, but it became permanent. And it's still being hosted by the World Bank as of today. All right, so as previously also mentioned by our speakers, last November 30, there was a decision of the COP28 adopting the draft text of the TC5. Unfortunately, it's really not being called a loss and damage fund. So it's not really called a loss and damage fund even. I think they are calling it a climate, it's something else, but they're not really calling it a loss and damage fund. So as previously mentioned also by our speakers, there's a total of 700 million pledges coming from developed countries. So for instance, the United States contributed 17.5 million US dollars to the fund. It's not really reflecting of the climate debt that they really owe to developing countries. So again, 17.5 million is actually peanuts when you compare, for instance, the amount of aid that they are giving to certain countries for war and militarization. And there's also no indication whether the pledges are actually new and additional. Climate finance for loss and damage. Are those pledges going to be coming from adaptation, from their adaptation climate finance or mitigation finance? Are those badges are actually development aid being rebadged as climate finance for loss and damage, because that has been the experience of many developing countries. Last year, I think even at Sharm el-Sheikh, there have been many pledges being given by many developed countries, but those are for climate finance, but turns out they are not really actually new and additional. Okay, so what are actually our red lines for civil society coming here at COP28 in Dubai? For us, COP28 has the opportunity to redress the long-term imbalance of the climate negotiations and ensure that the international climate architecture works for the people and countries on the front line of climate impacts. Because for too long, we have seen that developed countries have pushed loss and damage off the negotiation agenda, even as loss and damage mounted, continue to worsen in the real world. So we need really to ensure that in this COP28, in the negotiations, loss and damage is addressed holistically across all the gamut of agenda items that are going to be taken at COP. So these are the critical areas that we actually need to be monitoring, ensuring that loss and damage is addressed in those agenda items. For one, I think, I'm not quite sure if you're familiar with the global stocktake of the Paris Climate Agreement. So essentially, the global stocktake of the Paris Climate Agreement, it is a system that's included in the Paris Climate Agreement, where countries are going to be reviewing their climate ambition and determining whether those climate ambitions, climate plans, climate commitments are actually aligned to the climate Paris temperature goal of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is essentially a review whether those climate commitments that are, and plans of countries are actually not going to are in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris temperature goal. So for the global stocktake agreement, we would like that it is going to be a process providing a clear idea of loss and damage occurring already and the pathways forward to address the gaps. Because currently the loss and damage in the technical report of the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement is only indicated as an element of adaptation. So all the discussions in the GST currently on the loss and damage, it is being subjugated under the discussions on adaptation. So there's really no dedicated discussions happening on the need to address loss and damage as a third pillar of climate action. So we know that actually that has been, the subsuming of the agenda of loss and damage under the adaptation agenda. It has been the result of the consistent tactic of developed countries to conflate adaptation with loss and damage and to diminish the urgent needs for new and additional finance for both adaptation and loss and damage. The other one is for us to, the other agenda that we would like to really see is the operationalization of the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage. So the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, it was a decision arrived at COP 25 in 2019 in Madrid. Basically, the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage is supposed to assist developing countries to to learn more about their specific needs related to loss and damage, and to help them devise strategies to address loss and damage. But right now, the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, it's still just a website, and we need to get it up and running. We need to ensure that the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage is funded and operationalized to really start supporting developing countries to develop approaches to addressing loss and damage so that changes on the ground can be implemented immediately and ramped up when the funding is already provided through the Loss and Damage Fund. Sorry. Sorry. And then finally, the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG negotiations. So again, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance was established as part of the Paris Climate Agreement to replace the 100 billion US dollar a year goal agreed in 2020, which only focused on mitigation and adaptation. So we need the current negotiations on the climate finance architecture that's going to replace the 100 billion US dollar goal to be including a sub-goal on loss and damage. All right, so actually for us, civil society, beyond all these monitoring of negotiations in agenda items at COP, we would also like to take this opportunity to have a really thorough discussion on the kind of loss and damage fund that we would like to be established. A people's loss and damage fund. We would like to have a loss and damage fund that is a standalone loss and damage fund operating within the financial mechanism of the COP, of the convention, and under the guidance and accountable to the COP. We would like that developing countries have a direct access to the loss and damage fund. We would also like that the loss and damage fund establish a floor of funds to be raised and disbursed each year. I think there was the amount that civil society and developing countries have been pointing to with regard to the amount that needs to be raised is $400 US per year for addressing loss and damage in developing countries. So definitely the contributions that we are receiving right now is not measuring up to the problem. But are there also other options for us to push developed countries to be able to pay for the damage, for the losses and damages that developing countries are incurring with regard to climate change? The continued erosion and innovation of duties under the COP by wealthy nations has led to people and communities to actually look for other options. International and national courts have long upheld the right to remedy and reparations, and they are now starting to do so in the context of climate harm. There are also advisory proceedings currently underway before the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the International Court of Justice that seek to provide clarity on states' international obligations in the context of climate change and the consequences of breaching legal duties. But also, I think it's also very important in fighting for a people's loss and damage fund. The role of people's movement is going to be important because those people's movements, people's organizations, are the ones that are going to create the necessary political pressure to states to really act. Yeah, so that's going to be my input for today. Maybe we can have a few more minutes. We have 15 minutes actually for questions and answer from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, Ibn Akaiban, in terms of time, I said probably we'll take 3 questions to a very, very heavy and powerful panel we have here. I think we have 20 minutes. 15 minutes. So I open up the floor. Please. This is your opportunity. Perspectives, observation, and maybe ask specific speakers. Just say your name, just stand up, just say your name quickly and probably shoot out.
I am Shoma Datta from India. First, congratulations to the panel, good, young, energetic panel, and those who will be facing the climate crisis, good that they are taking the lead. 2 very important perspectives that we must not forget. In the euphoria in the loss and damage funds creation and operationalization, though it's peanut, I think you have all pointed out how little it is. It will help if you put it in perspective. Last year's Pakistan floods estimate is $16.8 billion losses. The 2013 Haiyan you were mentioning, in India we had a massive Himalayan disaster because of it was climate triggered. Even in our South Asian estimation, that caused a loss of $4.9 billion. So when you talk about $725 million in the loss and damage fund today, we must keep it in perspective. And very important that all of you are talking about polluter pays. It's a very, very insufficient, inadequate measure. Polluter is not just polluting, it's killing millions of people. So just by paying a money, there must not be, which we notice here, must not be a feeling among developing countries and society as at large that they are doing enough. They must be held accountable far beyond the paying the money. And third and last point, the World Bank is a lending institution. It has no experience in grants. The second point, World Bank has a very high transaction cost. These two are clear negatives of the first 4 years, World Bank being the host. The only advantage is the World Bank is a financial institution which has an established accountability mechanism, the inspection panel, which is accessible for affected communities. So that's the only positive, two others negative. I think when we demand what should it be, how the loss and damage fund should be, what shape it should take, we must bring this out. This is to reduce our euphoria a little bit from the operation of the fund.
Thank you. I will take probably, with your due acceptance, panelists, I'll probably take another two due to time, then probably I'll give you, as you answer, you take your last concluding remarks. Any other perspectives, questions, reflections? Please, take this opportunity.
Hi, I'm Ala from the Philippines, and maybe I'll ask a question regarding the Philippines volunteering to be hosting the, like if you have, for the Filipinos in the panel, if you guys have a stance or an opinion on that volunteering, the Philippines volunteering to be a host in the L&D board. Yes.
And I'll take the last one. Sir? Anyone this side?
Hi, thanks for the panel. I thought it was really insightful. My name is Adil, and I work for Air Quality Asia, which is a nonprofit, and we're focused on how can we raise more money for the L&D fund. And I've been speaking to a lot of climate finance experts at COP who have said that, you know, like governments, of course, should be giving way more money, and it's clear that many of the rich nations don't want to acknowledge the reparations that they owe. And you know, my org has been exploring like how can we get the private sector to give more money, which has its own challenges because they're seeking profits and they don't view loss and damage as a profitable use of their money. And you know, a lot of these climate finance experts, they actually don't have a solution, you know? And so I was curious, I think France and a few other nations have suggested that we should tax the fossil fuel industry or tax certain financial transactions, maybe like the purchase of jet fuel by commercial airlines. So I'm curious what you all think about how do we raise the tens of billions, if not trillions, needed every year to truly cover the reparations and the loss and damages that vulnerable nations are facing. Thank you.
Thank you, the panel. Bridget, are you still there? I'll probably give you the first opportunity, madam.
Yes, I'm still there.
Are you okay? I hope you have heard the reflections and the questions.
I want to react to the last question concerning what possibilities are there to fulfill the loss and damage fund. We are convinced that concerning due diligence or how to say it, we are really convinced that multinational corporations have also to pay their share, and that the states need to take their responsibility to make these multinational corporations aware of it. So every corporation that finds itself in a certain country needs to be integrated in this type of financing, because they have themselves, in addition to all the responsibility of the states, they have themselves themselves economic activity that is far beyond what it is supposed to be, and it needs to be integrated in the responsibility for the emissions, historically and in present. This means that the international contract, the international plans to have a due diligence also from multinational corporations and state needs also to implement, to integrate finance, to be able to have at least the financial equivalent of what these, what all these emissions are causing. It's very clear that we can only have, by addressing this question, we can only have the material losses. So not to speak about the immaterial losses that are also very much part of loss and damage in such times of climate catastrophes. But at least these financial additional means, as we already always talking about additional means, it's not possible to address these climate finance questions without these additional means, so that they really could be in a way to, yeah, that they could come near what is really necessary. I leave it like that, also to leave space for the others to answer that.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Bridget. I will now ask the panel to start from the other end, and Ivan, you'll be the last one. Please, if you can now show maybe your feedback and some of your remarks, and also your concluding remarks. Probably I'll give you 2 minutes each.
Hello, I can do with one. Well, first of all, I would like to really just second what the member of the audience said about kind of looking at finance architecture and then just even taking one disaster and then just kind of balance, like seeing them in the numbers and seeing that the 750 million pledge is nowhere near enough. It's barely one disaster. And with regard to the Philippines, Alap, well, the Philippines, I think, is in a good position to host the fund. But civil society needs to put pressure on government to make sure that the transparency mechanism is there, that we make sure that the hosting of the fund will be held accountable to the UNFCCC process. I do think, however, that more than the issue of hosting of the board, what matters more are, number one, the operationalization of the board so that we can deliver money to the communities that need it most, and number two, that we fill the fund. Because what point is there to the World Bank and or the Philippines and or both if we don't have money to help those that need it most? And then with regard to the discussion of rich countries, I think it's just the science. Science is the answer. Personal experiences are the answer. The IPCC did say that even effective adaptation all over the world will no longer stop losses and damages. And I think that's where we begin. If they see that this is the hottest recorded summer in the history of the UK, if they see the wildfires in America, then maybe that's where we start, right? That's where we start. We start with stories, we start with narratives, and we start with what they see as well on the ground.
Thank you, ma'am. My dear sister.
Yeah, I will
Marinelle.
second that. Also, like I think for the Philippines, it is, for me, it's really important that we see how the Philippine government is, having that kind of relationship and genuine partnership with the CSOs and the sectors, and really having that kind of conversation and making sure that everyone is actually included if we host the loss and damage fund. And what Attorney Joy said, what's the implication, what it look like for also the CSOs in the Philippines, and how we can collaborate more. And just to respond to the question about the tax and how we can build up more funding for the loss and damage, I think I just want to raise that there is a climate inequality report that Oxfam has just been released, and it's a very, very comprehensive report to see how much the 1% super rich in the world is contributing 16% of the world's carbon emission, and if they are taxed at 60% of their incomes, it would cut the carbon equivalent of more than a total of the emission of the UK, and it would raise 6.4 trillion USD to fund renewable energy and transition away from fossil fuel. And to give you a little background, so in 2019, the super rich 1% were responsible of 16%, as I mentioned earlier, of global carbon emissions, which is the same emission of the poorest 66% of humanity, which is 5 billion people. And since the 1990s, the super rich 1% burned through twice as much of the carbon budget as the poorest half of humanity combined. The emission of the 1% are said to be over 22 times more than the safe limit, or the emissions allowed if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming in 2030. So I think it's really making rich polluters pay and taxing the rich, because we are aiming for a world that is just and fair for the 99%, and we really have to make the 1% nation accountable for their emission, and equitably share the resources to vulnerable nations and to 99% of the society.
Thank you, Marinelle.
Just
Josh, please.
Yeah, very
1 minute.
quickly responding to the last question, involving the private sector in increasing funds. Based on our experiences over the past several decades, when the private sector has been involved in what they call sustainability funding, the decisions for the funding, their allocation, their use are business-driven, completely business-driven. So I think when we talk about how increasing private sector role and their responsibility towards funding for loss and damage, how we can increase that, I think we need to be very cognizant of where that funding is going, what's the business decision that's driving them, and are the private sector actors going to be, to what extent are the private sector actors going to be involved in designing the framework of the funding and its utilization? I think that's very, very important.
Thank you, Josh. Ivan?
I think my colleagues have sufficiently addressed, the point about whether we should also tap into the private sector to be contributing to the loss and damage fund. But my additional perspective to that is that, of course, quantity is important. The quantity of climate finance is important. We are fighting for the need for the loss and damage fund to be actually reflecting the actual monetary financial demands of the most affected communities. But also we need to be emphasizing also that we need to have quality climate finance. And by that we mean that, especially for loss and damage, I don't think that there is a lot of appetite for the private sector with regard to the risks that would entail in investing in loss and damage projects, projects addressing loss and damage. But we also, yes, we need to be focusing also on the quality of climate finance. It needs to be grants-based. Definitely, we do not see that a loss and damage disbursed in the form of loans is it's a grave injustice for frontline communities. We also need to be sure that the loss and damage climate finance is predictable, and that it's going to be a steady source of fund that frontline communities can tap into when they need those funds to address their concerns. Yes.
Okay, Ivan. I probably cut you short there since they are waving to me. I will spend the last 30 seconds. Let me put some Pacific face into the whole discussion. I wear a seed. We are producing no more of this, our women, because when it drops down, it lay plums, so we no more. Our women cannot do this anymore. And we do this also. These are from bucks. And now I will turn it. And they designed this. They do this. This costs $35 US, this piece. Now there's no more. They use the brown, this comes out of mangrove barks and a mixture of red podzolic soil. We cannot do the soil because it's getting harder. So this is the issue for us when we talk about loss and damage. So with those few concluding remarks, I think let's have a big round of applause to the panel. And I thank the group of sponsors and organizers, Ibon International, et al., and the rest. Thank you so much for the forum.
What do you want to say, Mike? We just came.
Thank you. Thank you. We just.
All right.